So welcome everybody to the third one of these lectures. Um, we will first cover the stuff that we ran out from last week's set, and then we dive into the part three. As always, I'm going to try to take some breaks and ask you questions on the microphone, but you can write questions into the chat at any given time, and when I take a break, I'll answer those questions when we get there. All right, let's get going. So you've already seen this multiple times before, but this is some of my background, the companies and games I work with over the years in my 20+ year career in games. Today I work at Sony Studios, Harsmark Studio, which is the oldest still running game studio here in Finland. As many of you probably know, we are coming out with a game called Saros this week. In fact, right now, today, people who bought the digital deluxe edition or some other edition that gave you early access, those people are playing the game today, right now, and the rest of the people who have bought the game will get access to it on official launch date, which is 30th of this month, 2 days from now. But it's important for you to know, and for me to tell you, for legal reasons, that I am not here representing the views and opinions of Sony or Housemarque in any way. I am representing only myself and my own company called JR Game Consulting in what I'm talking about today. So this is third part of the lecture series for this year. There's also a lecture from last year about short agile project management. You can check all of those out in GameCity, Kajaani YouTube channel if you have not seen those or participated in those previous lectures before. This is the stuff that we've covered. We got halfway, well, almost all the way through the sprint section last week, and we'll finish it today before diving into part three. So this is where we finished last week, reviewing at the end of the iteration. So we talked a lot about the conceptual loop and how does that translate to a Scrum process. When we're talking about the reviewing at the end, we're talking about the delivery and celebration bits of that conceptual loop. And in terms of Scrum, it's covering this end bit. So there's two important aspects to reviewing your sprint or any iteration format that you're using. One is looking at the product and reviewing the progress in the product itself, and one is looking at it from a project perspective and how is that going along. For product reviews, you really want to be evaluating your new build of the game and any other deliverables, including tools and other things that you might be doing. For example, your programmer could be making a tool for your level designer to make levels faster for the game and so forth. So you want to be reviewing those actual deliverables, especially those builds, documents and other things as well, but the build is the most important thing. And a big part of that is, of course, playtesting the game. It's a very good culture to get into playtesting your game often, and end of your iteration is a great moment to have a bit more solid build with new features, new content that you can all playtest together and learn from that. Then the game can teach you what direction to take the game next. You can also get other people to playtest it, whether that's other teams in the program or coaches or any other playtesters you want to use for that. And I think, as far as I know, the program has been trying to help you with that, using Comc students and other sources for playtesters for your games. So this is a very important part, because at the end of the day, we're making a game. So following the progress of the game, reevaluating it, and potentially replanning your backlog and future based on that. And again, somebody dares to be late, even though I was late. Somebody's even more late. Axel, shame on you for being late. But welcome, nonetheless. So, the other part is the project side. This is also important, not as glorious and interesting. We all want to focus on the game, right? But if we focus on how we're getting the game done, we will get a better game out there. And here we're evaluating the progress against the plan. Are we on target? Are we not? And what to do about it. So remember, maybe last time we talked about the multiple different end conditions of a sprint, and we talked about how the most likely scenario in most of your sprints is a partial delivery of the PBIs, the product backlog items for that sprint. So when you then reviewing, you're focusing on the ones that you got done, right? And just like you were building a burn down using the template that I showed you last time, which hopefully Jones or somebody else from the program has shared with you, you were following that burn down to see how you're tracking against the goals of the sprint. You can do the same thing with another tab in that template to track your overall burn down for the entire project and in production phase. Are you on target to finishing everything you want to do before end of production? And then you want to be calculating your velocity in terms of product backlog items. So any PBI that you fully finished during the sprint, you take that backlog's estimate size from your backlog estimate, not from your sprint estimates, as the velocity that you earned by finishing it. And you can mark them down in your product backlog. If you then find out by play testing it that you want to add things to that item still, you can either treat it as keeping that item open and adding context to it, or what I recommend is that you then create additional iteration or polish items for that particular feature and treat them as separate features in your backlog. That way your velocity towards the goal might be more on par, because you then have to balance and reprioritize those polish items against everything that has not been done. Because the reality is that you will not finish all the features in your backlog, and you will not be able to polish all of the features to the level content that you want. So sometimes it's better to focus on new features rather than polishing the old features. But that's always a judgment call. What should be the next focus? What is the most likely way to push the game forward? Always keeping in mind that you're not going to finish all the work that you want to. When you have an unfinished PBI, however, the velocity is 0. Even if it's 90% done, we treat it as 0, and we only look at it again once we get to replanning sprints. It goes back to the product backlog, and you then need to reprioritize against all the other work. Often what happens is you continue with that work right away in the next sprint, but not always. There might be good reasons why you need to focus on some other things, and that is left in the backlog. And whatever is half finished and left in the backlog, there's a risk that all of that work went to waste and will be cut from the game, at least for the initial launch. And that time would have been better spent elsewhere. This is why we so much talked about last time about evaluating your sprint progress during the sprint and focusing on priorities even inside the sprint, so that we minimize this things that are unfinished at the end of the sprint but have been started and some work has gone against them, because that work is all potentially lost. So the tasks are also valuable for you. You can use if you track the actual time spent on tasks, that's good data for you to become better at estimating in your next sprint planning and take learnings from those. But they don't as such feed into the velocity. They don't as such feed into your product backlog level and your roadmap level. They're just there to help you become better at estimations. So extra credit for you to be really good at this is you look at your original estimates and your actual time spent and you analyze those differences. That is a great teaching tool. Again, about how do you estimate and how do you plan, and you can become better. Estimation is never perfect, but it can be improved. But it only improves if you actually take a critical eye on how did you arrive at such an estimate, and what did you learn, and why were you off in your original estimate, and then that will inform your future attempts at estimating tasks. For those unfinished PBIs that have tasks underneath them, those tasks might be relevant in the future, especially if you continue in the next sprint. But if those items go back to backlog and they stay there for a long time, the risk increases that those tasks become obsolete and irrelevant, and it's just as good to then just do new tasks underneath those PBIs when you work at them again. Because if there's a long time has lapsed between when you last worked on it and you work on it again, the game has moved forward and certain things affect the implementation. So again, a reason why we want to be very diligent on how we focus and reprioritize our sprints along the way. And then about the I apologize, but the way Sony sets up our Google Meets is there's an annoying sound every time somebody joins, and I have to go and admit them manually. So it's very disruptive when people join these lectures late. So we talked about this velocity chart last time. This is just a way to record the historical velocity data that you can then use as your estimation how to commit to future sprints. And this is again in the Google Sheet template that I showed you last time. So all of this work, you're going to need your Google Sheet template as well as your hack and plan. If you're using some other tool, there might be ways to do it inside the tool, but these are the tools we're teaching in the program because they are free and available for everybody without any cost and relatively easy to learn. So that sort of finishes the loop of the normal Scrum iterative loop. We didn't cover retro yet. We're going to do it later today. But that sort of finishes the topic that we were discussing last week. So on part 1, we talked about how do you build your backlog. And then part 2 was focused on how do you use that backlog to drive your iterative loop of making the game incrementally better with running back-to-back sprints. How do you plan them? How do you review them, the progress along the way? And then how do you review the final result at the end of the sprint? And before we go to the new agenda, let's look at what questions we have accumulated. Rika asks, so should the PBI be the one that has points and the tasks no story points? Or should the tasks that make up the PBI have individual points? So you should use some sort of points and estimates on both, but they should be different estimates. And the number of points in the tasks do not need to equal the PBIs. The PBIs have product backlog points, often called story points or something else, and they could be, if you're following my recommendation, they would be done using relative estimations and a Fibonacci scale. Your task estimates are completely different, and they can be more dependent on the person doing them as well. And if you there want to use hours or days or ideal days, or again, abstract points, is up to you and less critical. Many teams who use relative estimations and Fibonacci on the backlog level, they still use days or hours during the sprints because that's a shorter thing. And also remember that the sprint is a commitment. So the time makes more sense. And you're only thinking about the next, usually 2 weeks, which is 10 business days and maybe 12 days in calendar time. So that's a shorter time and a smaller scope of work. The backlog items have their own points and you do math with them, and the tasks have their own points and you do math with them, but you should not mix those. That's like mixing apples and oranges together. Hopefully that answered your question. Okay, let's move forward. And again, keep the questions coming. So the agenda for this week, we talk about roadmap planning, continuous improvement, and then reporting to coaches. And if we have time, we'll go into the short Kanban introduction. Like I already said, we will probably not have time to cover all of this today, If that's the case, then we will book one more session of these lectures in early May. So roadmap planning. We talked about the backlog building in part 1, and now we talked about the iterative thing. So now we're going back to how do you put these sprints and iterations together to fulfill and do all the stuff in your roadmap, in your backlog. So our lives revolve around natural cycles. Time in many ways is cyclical. We have days, weeks, months, quarters, and years. You could also say decades and even longer centuries, but hopefully nobody's going to spend decades making one game, at least not pre-launch game. Some of these are artificial that we have made for ourselves as humans, but many of them come from nature, such as the day cycle and the month cycle, and even the year cycle. They come from the cyclical nature of how planets rotate and around their own axis and around the sun. Quarters and weeks are more artificial cycles defined by humans that we have found useful for one reason or another. So if we map these into your projects, the longer the time, the less frequent it happens, the more intangible it is, and the shorter the time frame, the more concrete and the more frequent those cycles. So the day is clearly mapped to the daily cycles, and we in Scrum Scrum defines a daily stand-up, and whether it's a stand-up or some other format, we really highly recommend you run some sort of daily communication, ideally synchronous, but maybe asynchronous. If daily is too often, then is it every second day or twice a week or something? But try to find those synchronous communication moments somewhere along the way. Then along the week level, you run a sprints, whether that's 1 week or 2 weeks. On a month level, we talked about that's a good reference for milestones. And then quarters is every 3 months is a quarter of a year. And we've already talked about how your production period for this GameLAB year will be 2 quarters, aka 6 months. And then a year to ship the game was the whole agenda of the entire GameLAB. So by the end of this year, you should have all shipped a game. Some of you multiple games, but most of you shipping one game. And then you map your different ceremonies that you need to run your process to these cycles. Dailies in the daily cycle, sprint plannings, backlog groomings, and these sessions into your weekly cycle, and then different kinds of release planning events in your monthly cycle. In the first time we talked, we looked at the cyclical view to a year. We were then in early April, now we're in late April. You spent the first quarter with Klaus and Jussi focusing on your concept and prototyping. We are now about a month into our pre-production and production phase. So you're about 1/6 done in your entire production time right now. So your game should be 1/6 done, right? And then you will be finalizing bug fixing and polishing and releasing your game in the last quarter. So you have 6 weeks, 6 months, 26 weeks. If you use monthly milestones, 6 milestones, and about 12 to 13 sprints, out of which almost a month is already gone to finish this thing. So time is short. Make sure you scope your games accordingly. So how do you then use a roadmap planning to make sense of that time schedule so you keep yourself honest? Because otherwise, what's going to happen is your work is going to slip and it's going to balloon so that you try to do 80% of the game in the last 20% of your time remaining because you have not been moving fast enough early. So let's look at some typical milestone definitions in game development that might help you. A bit caveat, there is no one correct definition for any of these. These are my personal ones. I will use some terms that are very similar and people use them slightly differently in different contexts. You already saw that when Jussi presented you one view of a development cycle, and I presented another one in my first part of this lecture series. There's no conflict or misalignment there. It's just a different way of looking at the same thing, all trying to get to the same place, which is we make some sense and set some mid-term milestones for our projects so that we make sure that we stay on schedule. So I talked about the typical roadmap for a pre-launch game. Post-launch and live is different, and how it often broken into classically pre-production and production. But if you dig in deeper, many people are breaking it down to concept, prototyping, and pre-production, production, and post-production phases with clear focuses and sort of questions they're trying to answer. And let's look at some of these questions we're asking. How do these map to commonly used milestone definitions in games industry? So when we're talking about what are we making, there's multiple ways of talking about it. And some people use these definitions slightly differently, but this is how I use them. So for proof of concept, we mean something that is proving your game concept. You can also making a proof of concept for a feature or a tool or something else. But when we're talking about the entire game, the proof of concept is the very earliest build of the game, even if it's a throwaway prototype that is trying to prove to you or your investors or somebody else in your stakeholder group that this game is worth making. And what is it that we're making? Prototypes are then usually more focused for testing certain parts of your game. And you might be doing multiple prototypes in parallel, testing different teams in isolation from each other. Because if you make a new prototype and you're changing 5 or 15 different things in that prototype, how do you know which one really is moving in the right direction, which was in the wrong direction? So often when you make a prototype, you're only changing one variable at a time to really be more pseudoscientific about being able to test how does this change impact the overall experience of the game. And then first playable, again, a very often used but very widely defined differently in different studios. When I talk about first playable, I'm talking about something that is testing the entire core loop of your game concept. And this is most likely, if I understood, the sort of prototype that Klaus wanted you to have at the end of your Q1 concept phase. But all of these have the same thing in common, that they're all trying to make sure that we're making the right game. They're not so focused on can we make the game and how much is it going to take to make the game. They're focused on, is this game worth making? Is this the right game for us to make? And you should have all done this already during first quarter, right? If not, you have some catching up to do to get on schedule. But when we then move into more pre-production phase, we start talking about how are we going to make it and how much of it can we make. So just because the game is worth making, we need to figure out how much. If it's a linear game, how many hours of gameplay, how many levels can we do, how many bosses, environments, how many weapons, how many of different things can we do, and how much of each of these is going to cost us to make. So that forces you to prove how you're making them, as well as the quantity of them. And some of the milestones that are often used are things like vertical slice, which means a cross-section of your entire game. And this is relevant for all types of games, really, and very commonly used. Horizontal slice is a slightly different idea. It's taking the whole game playable through, but at a very rough format. And this is mostly relevant for very linear games, something like Alan Wake, which you play from start to finish once. It will not be very relevant for a roguelike or some other game which is more focused on replayability aspects of it. Some people also talk about white boxing. That just means that they're making all their levels in white boxes. Classically, at least in the past, Valve used to talk about orange boxing, They made orange box levels, and they even named one of their products Orange Box, which was a collection of some of their games sold on one DVD together. And then you have things like art targets and pretty corners, which are all trying to focus on what is this going to look like. Ideally, these would be done with the final tech and pipelines that you intend to do your assets with, because then it also gives you an idea of the cost of making these and a better idea of, are these realistic to make and how many of these can we make? But their main focus is on driving you towards what is this going to look like. They're also often a great selling tool for investors and others who usually don't understand the inner workings of game development as well, and something visual is easier for them to evaluate. So you can think of vertical slices as a slice of cake, which is touching on all the areas of the game, from core gameplay to second gameplay to the meta loops and progression, UI, UX, all of these sort of aspects, but taking as narrow a chunk of them as possible to really prove the game that you're making. And white boxing, this could be an example of a white box. You just make your levels very rough, untextured. Everybody can immediately see that you're not even trying to go for final quality visuals, and you don't need artists to make this. Designers and level designers should be able to make these themselves, and you're really testing the flow, especially in multiplayer games. How does this level start to flow when you run around doing stuff? Or if it's a linear game, how understandable is the flow to the player? Is the player guided to the right directions already by the geometry itself before you add other subtle hints of design to guide the player's focus in the right areas? And you could make it in orange, like Valve used to do, just very rough levels that you can start playtesting with. Another way to look at it is take the cake metaphor a little further, right? A horizontal slice is a slice of the entire width of the cake, whereas a vertical slice is taking a little bit of each layer of the cake. And a pretty corner could be part of the vertical slice or a horizontal slice, or it could be a completely separate deliverable that is not touching on those experiences at all. Whatever makes sense for your workflows. For example, when we worked on a multiplayer shooter in UK, we had white box levels for playtesting, and you could really playtest the game 15 versus 15. And then there's one corner of that level that if you drove there with your vehicle and you positioned your camera right, all you could see was production quality art assets, and you could really get the feel for what the game should look like. But when you were driving around the rest of the level, we didn't let the constraint of how expensive it is to do art to limit ourselves from iterating on the gameplay and the level design of that level. And everything on top of that cake is just final polish, and you should not be focusing on that during your earlier milestones and iterations, because if things change below, all of that polish work goes to waste. So it's very important to think about when you do your final polish. And a bit of warning about horizontal slices in software development. They use the term differently. They often talk about an application layer level thing, because there isn't necessarily that sort of linear experience to a software tool than there is to a game. So if you Google horizontal slices, you're going to get some software references that don't really match the definition I'm talking about here. And here are some abstracted examples of vertical slices that I found online with the exact details omitted. But the vertical slice could have things like crafting, stealth, combat, and the level up or progression system in the thing. Or it could be a combination of your RPG elements, your combat, your physical and logical puzzles. Whatever those core elements of your game is, you should include them as part of a vertical slice. So I can't tell you what your vertical slice or horizontal slice should contain, because it's so dependent on your game. But as concepts, these are very valuable milestones to put on your roadmap, because they start validating your game and start improving the amount of learning the game can give you back on what it needs next to become ready and fully mature. And then when we start going into post-production, it's about finishing the game, finishing the fight. And you hear things like alphas and betas and release candidates and so forth. What do these mean? Well, alpha is often either a feature complete or a feature lock, or these can be separate. But if we leave the alphas and betas out, because unless you're in a professional environment, they're not very helpful descriptions. They often come from the publishing partner. If you're working with a publisher, they will probably have these definitions. And if they're paying for your development, they might have some payments and milestone bonuses related to these as well. But if we focus on what does it mean for game development, it's maybe more useful in the GameLAB terms. So feature complete is something where the build contains all the features you aim to have with the released games. They don't need to be final, but they all need to be in. After your feature complete, you should not be adding any new features to your game. Feature lock means that you have locked all the features, so they're final, barring bug fixing. So you're not touching them unless there's a bug. And if you want to do some polish there, you should be treating it as a bug and go through similar processes as you would go with bugs, triaging them against everything else. And the reason is if you don't start locking these down, it's very hard for the content to be final. And it's very hard for the balancing of the game to be final if the features are still changing. And if you keep changing the features very late, you risk creating cascading effects that affects other parts of the game, breaks your economy, or becomes technically unstable, or some other things that might be hard to catch in the end. So you want to start locking things down little by little and be more strategic about what you're still changing. When you then go into the content side, you also have content completes and content locks, and it's the sort of same thing for content. So all the art and design and audio and all these assets should be then first incomplete in the build, but you can still iterate them and polish them, and then in final, they all final, and you're not doing anything other than bug fixing anymore. So I would like you to have some sort of milestones like that in your thing. Now, release candidates and master candidates are things that don't really come into production. You might want to utilize these in your fourth quarter of the year when you go into the finalization period. But that's probably then a discussion with whoever coach is leading that quarter with you. Release candidates, you usually start with RC0 and you go to as many RCs as needed. A release candidate is a build that you submit to QA with the hopes that they approve it, and then that becomes your release build. So any release candidate could be a potential release build. And how many of them are depends on how well you're bug fixing your game and how much time and money you have available to keep fixing. We all know that most games ship with bugs. The question is just how many bugs and how bad the bugs are. Some games are very famous and some developers are very famous. Let's take Cyberpunk 2077. What did they take 6 months or a year to get rid of all the major bugs before the game was truly playable? And you might not ever run to master candidates because that relates to gold master and that relates to physical media. So our games here at Housemarque, for example, are still printed on discs. And the master disc, where all the other discs used to be copied from, was a golden disc, and that's why it's called the Gold Master. It's literally the blueprint disc that the other ones are printed from. So the Gold Master candidate is referring to essentially the same thing as a release candidate, but for a physical release. So release candidate, master candidate, somewhat similar. Of course, then, when your master candidate, your physical copy of the game has gone out, like in our case, we are still patching it afterwards and we're still even releasing DLC on top of it. Those are then again new release candidates for each of those. So if you have a day 0 patch and a day 1 patch or day 15 patch, whatever, those all go through the release candidate pipelines again, because they also need to be bug fixed and tested so that they don't introduce new bugs. So how does this relate to your year here at the GameLAB? Like we talked, in pre-production, you're trying to answer how are we making the game and how much of the game can we make? And the end of that goal, some combination of arc target, vertical slice, or a horizontal slice would be a good goal to really prove to you that this is the game you're making and get a better idea of how much it's going to cost. And at that point, cut everything that you don't think you're going to get done by end of September this year. And then you can go into production. The sooner you can go there, the better, but make sure you do your homework first. Then it's just about making it. To me, the pre-production is the most important part of the game development process, because that's where you have to kill some of your darlings and prove the ones that are going to end up in the game. Production is then more predictable process of just making more of it, in a sense, because your core of your game has been proven and locked down. And towards the end of production, you want to have some sort of feature complete or even a feature lock, and a content complete and a content lock to first lock down the features, because you often have to then still do some content work on top of those features so that they are fully exposed to a player in a meaningful sense. So that's why you first want to lock the features and then the content. That also means that the coders can start focusing on bug fixing the features, while some content people are still doing content. And then by end of September, ideally, all of you would have both feature and content locked game, and you're fully in final bug fixing and polish for post-production, and then launching the game by the end of the year. And remember, at every stage, when you think you're out of scope or out of schedule, you're behind schedule, you can't finish all of your scope, keep rescoping your thing. And that's what I talk about roadmap level planning. You have these bigger milestones, they really teach you where you are, and then that makes you make those tough decisions of what to keep and what to cut from the game. When you're outside of the GameLAB program, running your own company, spending your own money, feel free to run as long as you have money and energy. But in the GameLAB program, you need to finish the game in a year. In a realistic sense, also, as a company, you're going to have somebody else who's putting money into it. Investors, publishers, they want you to stay on budget and schedule, because time equals money if you're paying people's salaries and other costs. So you will always, in professional setting, have to make compromise decisions on how much you can fit into your game in the time and budget allowed. A concept called MVP, minimum viable product, is something that is talked a lot in the startup circles, and it's a good thing to keep in mind. If you start building your game like a manufacturing line of a car, bit by bit, then you don't have a car until it's all finished and 100% done. And as we've already talked along the way, you will probably never get 100% finished and done with your backlog. So if that's your approach, you might never be able to finish and ship a game before you run out of time and money. It's better to make a game that keeps evolving and getting bigger, even if there's a bit of overhead, like in this visualization here, because that means that at every stage, you have something that you could potentially ship earlier, and you can keep building on top of it. And that way you can guarantee that you're at least shipping something. Hey, you didn't get to finish a roof on your car, but at least you shipped a car without a roof, which some people pay more money for than a car with a proper roof, right? So keep this concept also in mind in how you prioritize your work within your roadmap when you work with your backlog and your roadmap planning. And again, much of this you should be able to do in Hack and Plan. Some of those more visual items you might want to be doing in other tools, Miro or some text tool, to be defining these things might be easier than trying to do all of it in Hack and Plan. But make sure that whatever you do is also reflected in Hack and Plan, using some sort of milestone tagging or something else to indicate which items belong to which milestone. Exactly how to do it in Hack and Plan, Trace your man, he's going to teach you how to do it. Okay, I'm going to take a short question break here if anybody has any questions. Is there any practical difference between a burn down chart and a burn up chart, or is it just a preference? There are minor changes. Obviously, the visual one is, does it burn up or does it burn down? And it has to do with things like what happens when you add scope. to your backlog along the way. A burn down chart often hides the fact. It might seem that you're just progressing more slowly because instead of the number getting smaller, it's getting bigger when you add work to your backlog. In burn up, it's easier to visualize if your burn up, if your backlog size grows along the way. I happen to prefer burn downs than burn ups. And in my ideal situation, I use an adjusted burn down, which can also show you the increase of backlog size. But that's a bit more advanced technique, and it's hard to draw a graph like that in spreadsheets. So I didn't want to be introducing such complicated concepts because I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible for you. But for your purposes, burn down chart is the easiest version. If you prefer burn up, feel free to do it. Feel free to use it, but then I'll leave it to your own exercise to make a template for it. Which one should I use for sprint burn down? Hack and Plan only admits using one kind of things everywhere. Yes, so a free to use version of Hack and Plan has limited support for things like burn downs, which is why we have used time to create this Google spreadsheet template that Jones hopefully has shared with all of you, that you can use that to generate your burn downs. And it has a separate tab for sprint and your product backlog. And you can always duplicate that tab if you want to keep your each sprint as a historical record for yourself. So just keep duplicating that tab to create more tabs, one for each sprint. So my recommendation is don't use Hack and Plan for the burn downs at all. If you want to use your Hack and Plan burn down, then you have to make a compromise which one you want to use it for. And again, talk to Shrey about how to do that and which one he recommends, and make your choices based on it. But my recommendation is just use the spreadsheet to get around that limitation of the tool. Where does Steam demo relate to pre-production and production? That's a good question. That's more publishing and launch strategy rather than production thing. Early access has become very popular, but at the same time, the more people play early access, the higher expectation they have for the quality of that build already. So you could even argue that the thing you launch at the end of the year is your first Steam release. If you then mean demo as in a limited version of the game that people can download and pay for free before they play the entire game that costs you money, well, again, that would have to be part of the features that you develop as part of your production. And then you would probably want to launch that at the same time or after your game, so that people who try the demo can immediately convert and pay for your full game. Because if they play the game months before they are able to buy your actual game, the intent to purchase might vanish because they have played 12 other games in between and they've forgotten about your game. So this all relates to release and publishing strategy. And hopefully the program is providing you with a publishing and hopefully the program is providing you with publishing or marketing coaching that is going to talk to you about those sort of things. So burn down chart would have sprint items, and sprint items should have points. Yes, so keep a separate burn down for your milestones, your product roadmap burn down, which has PBIs and the velocity data based on them. And you use that for the entire GameLAB year. And then for each sprint, you have a separate burn down that is tasks. God damn it. And a separate burn down with tasks, and the estimates of those tasks are the numbers used there, that is focusing on, are you on track to finish your sprint? The other type is looking at, are you on track to finish your sprint? So that you can adjust along the sprint. And the other burn down is looking at your roadmap, your whole backlog, and are you on target to finish the entire game production by end of September? So 2 different graphs, 2 different items, 2 different number schemes, and you use them for 2 different things. Hopefully that clarified it. Okay. Any other?
I'm still a little bit confused about that, because we have earlier we had tasks that are separate, and now after your last lecture, I was like, okay, we will have 3 PBI items that we take to the sprint.
Yes.
And then we split down that into tasks. So should the tasks that make up a PBI item have points, or just the PBI items that were picked for this sprint? Right now, our sprint burn down at day 5 of 7 looks like nothing got done, because none of the 3 tasks or 3 PBI items have been done, even though there have been task things done.
And this is exactly why you want numbers for both, right? So your PBI items, your product backlog items, and the numbers that they have, they are trying to help you stay on track for your entire 6 months of production, right?
Yeah.
The tasks and the numbers on them are used only within that sprint, and they're exactly for that purpose. So you can evaluate, are you on track to hit the sprint goals or not? Because remember, if you have 3 PBIs committed to your sprint and it's starting to look like you can't finish all of them, then you have to have a serious discussion with the team. Can you refocus the team on 2 of them or 1 of them to at least finish 1, so that by the end of the sprint, you could play test that PBI in the build and get it to a place where it's actually playable? Because if you have all 3 PBIs half finished, you don't necessarily have anything you can play test at the end of the game, because everything's broken and half finished. But if you finished even 1 of them, then you have made clear progress in the thing, right? Think of it in terms of this, right? If you aim for the scooter, but you got a skateboard, well, then you still have 4 wheels and a board finished by the end of the thing that you can move along with. And if you take that metaphor to a game, you have at least some features in the game that you can play test that were not there 2 weeks ago. And you have progress, right?
Yeah.
I know it sounds like a more duplicate work, but there's a good reason why, because they serve different 2 needs. Good questions, Rico. Keep them coming. I'm here to help. All right. So next topic, continuous improvement. And this is where we talk about the retros and what are they for. The last part of the sort of Scrum framework that we haven't talked about. Continuous improvement comes from a Japanese concept called Kaizen. Kaizen just means change good, or good change, or continuous improvement, as it's often translated from those 2 kanji characters. And the most important ways to do continuous improvement, the 2 things that feed it inside game projects, are called retrospectives and postmortems. They're slightly different things. Often we use them interchangeably, but there's actually a nuanced difference. Retrospectives are for improving the ways you work continuously over time. That's why there's a retrospective in basic Scrum defined as at the end of every sprint. Now, whether you do it every sprint or every couple of sprints, it's still a point that you do it during the project. Whereas postmortem is something bigger that you do at the end of the project, and those learnings will hopefully help you in the next project. Or you might do a postmortem at the end of a pre-production phase to take those learnings in the production phase. But often it's hard to make those learnings actionable, because they come so much later after the fact. You wasted a lot of time instead of improving it earlier. So I would focus rather on retrospectives that go on all the time than bigger postmortems that happen less often. And that's why we're not really talking about postmortems as part of this teaching, but focus on retrospectives in this lecture series as well. So how do you do retrospectives? Well, many of you have probably done these. There's a gazillion formats. Miro or other visual tools are often used. You could do start, stop, continue. You should do what went well, what could have been done better, or many other formats. Roses and I think in Finnish, ruusuja ja risuja, roses and thorns is a way. There's multiple different ways. There's even whole books printed that are just introducing different types of retrospective workshops that you could run. If you Google Agile retrospective book, you will find multiple books like that. So world's your oyster. Miro has multiple ready-made templates free to use that you could use. So to me, it doesn't really matter which format. Use any format you wish. It might even be a good idea to vary the formats over time to keep it fresh and engaging for people. The only advice I give you is focus on the action items. While it's therapeutical to complain together about all the problems that you're facing, what really brings you the biggest value is if you can come up with concrete action items, how to improve the way you work. In the context of the GameLAB program, we want you to run your improvement ideas by the coaches, either by me or Shrey, ideally, or some other coach or program. And that's because with great power comes great responsibility. It's very easy for you to break the cycle, that cycle loop that we do to make the game better if you don't understand everything that your changes happening. A very common change that, sorry to pick on programmers again, the programmers love, the more introverted ones suggest that we stop dailies because we can be more efficient if we just asynchronously send each other a Slack or Discord message. And then the most brilliant of those programmers even program a bot that generates those Slack messages into the Slack channel automatically based on their version control submits. And they never have to tell anybody what they're doing because it's automatically coming from the way they work. But what happens on the other end is nobody's reading these automated messages. And then after a while, you realize that nobody's in sync. Nobody knows what the other people are doing. You're duplicating work. You're accidentally destroying each other's work. You're trying to getting to submit conflicts in your version control, and you need to start doing merges and other difficult things to make sure that nobody's work is destroyed. And work goes wasted because you were not communicating. It's a team effort to make a good game. No professional, whether that's a designer or a programmer, can make a game alone, or if they can, then they're wearing multiple hats. They're wearing the designer hat and the programmer hat. But if they want to do that, then they should not be part of a GameLAB team. They should then make the game alone in their own time and do the size game that they have scale, time and scope and skill sets to do. But if you're working as a team, you have to be communicating both synchronously and asynchronously over time to really leverage the power of the different perspectives and different skill sets that different team members have. And for more extroverted of you, it's more fun to work as a team than solo. So that's just one extreme example that can happen when people change things that they don't understand. Please talk to us, present to us the changes you want to introduce and why, and what do you think the benefits are going to be, and then we will be giving you advice whether that makes sense or not, and what are some of the pros and cons that might come with that decision. Of course, if you're running your own company in the future, nobody's there to babysit you, and you will do what you do and take the risks and carry the consequences. But we are providing you some training wheels here on purpose to make sure that you all ship a game by the end of this year and get that positive experience under your belt that puts you on a better path as part of the incubation and acceleration programs to become companies in the future. Before we go to the third section, any questions on continuous improvement? How many of you are planning to do retrospectives and continuous improvement, or how many are already doing it? Or are you planning to just skip that part? So is retrospective supposed to be about how to improve as a team? Yes. It could be about how do we communicate, how do we run our meetings, how do we do our planning, anything about the ways that you work as a team. That's the focus. The retrospectives is not about the product. You review the product separately and you review your ways of working separately. That's why in the Scrum diagram here, you see two separate things. You see a review thing and a retro thing, because the review is about the product review and retro is about product review and the project review. How is the project on schedule and how is the product coming along? And then the retro is, okay, how can we improve this thing? Hopefully that made sense.
It does make sense, but our retrospectives have some elements of reviewing the product. So I'm wondering how to improve so that the retrospective is more about how to improve our ways of working.
Yeah, I would keep them as separate. Even if you run them one after another, take a 5-15 minute toilet break and continue, just to get people into a different mindset. Because the agenda is often more efficient if you focus on a smaller, narrower thing, call it done, have a break, and go to the next thing, and then have focus on that. Because otherwise, you're rambling from one thing to another, and again, it's not as efficient use of time usually. That also means that you don't necessarily need to run retrospective after every iteration if the discussion doesn't seem to be fruitful and there's not a lot of improvement ideas coming from it. Pano is asking, we have done retrospective once, but that was quite customized, not using any board to visualize things, but thinking action points in our heads during the retro. Yeah, again, whatever format works for you. But I have found that many people are visual, especially when we're talking about complex things or long lists of things. Making them visual in front of everybody can be good for that collaborative atmosphere of that meeting. Okay, let's go to the next section. So, reporting to coaches. I am not going to be actively in touch with you all the time. I want you to be in touch with me if you need something from me after this lecture series. Shrey and Jones are going to be communicating with you more actively. This is to use the money of the program as efficiently as possible. Because the more hours I put in, I want to make sure that those hours are as focused for your team benefit as possible. So we had one round of catch-ups earlier. I'm not going to run those on any regular basis. I expect you to talk to me or Shrey or Jones to ask for my time if you want more coaching on a specific topic. But what I do want is some sort of proactive communication from your side to me and the other coaches telling how your team is doing. It's great for your internal communication as well, because since it's forcing you to fill this thing in, make sure that you're having those conversations as a team. Then you send it to us. It's also then works as an early warning system to keep us coaches aware of what's going on in your teams, and gives us coaches something to talk about when we're looking at your teams. And then we can decide based on that, hey, now you really need Jay's help, or that team really needs Mona's help, and prioritize the usage of the coach's time and the program's money to those areas and to those teams that really need it, because every team is going to have different needs, right? So there's going to be 3 parts to this, and I will again provide you a template. And again, it's going to be a free template using the Google toolsets. So it should be easy to use for everybody. The first part is about the game status. At the end of the day, we're making a game. We're not making a project. Project exists to make the game. So what is the status of the game now? Whatever way you find is best way to communicate to the coaches. It could be a link to the build and instructions how to access the build. It could be just videos or screenshots embedded, or however you want to do it. But think about, how do you want to represent the progress of your game to busy coaches who don't have time to chase down download instructions and other ways to get access to your game. Some coaches are happy to play your games. Other coaches are busier and they would just like to get a very brief update where the game is going. And I, for example, will probably not have time to play everybody's games, so some sort of videos or screenshots would be very much appreciated. It can also be words supporting that and describing what has been done. But think about what is a low effort for you, but high value information for coaches. And different coaches are different people, they have different needs. So I leave it quite loose how you want to do it, but there's some ideas how you could be doing it. Then there's a next section is going to focus on the sprint that you just finished, because you're going to send this to us after every sprint. What was your original sprint commitment? Your sprint goal as lists of PBI items. If you define some higher level goal or some milestone that is focused on, then make sure you write that down as well. This was our vertical slice build, or this was sprint 1 of 3 sprints we intend to do milestone 4. But at least at minimum, list of the PBIs that you were committed to in that sprint. And then tell us what your committed velocity was versus the historical velocity. While the first part about the game progress is useful for all coaches, this is aimed more for me and Shrey to keep a tab on where you are. And if you start to run into trouble with your scope of your game, we can jump in and help. And then sprint delivery, what was actually delivered? So it's the same list of goals, clearly marked either as done or not done. I don't care if it's 99% done. If it's not done 100%, then to me, it's not done. You don't get any credits for half-finished work. And then you want to embed your sprint burn down. You're free to use whatever tool you want, but what I recommend is the template I made for you. Should be easy to just screenshot it and add it to the report. And then the future. You should be looking at your future of your project. Are you on schedule? I would like to see the product backlog burn down. So in the previous one, you're sharing your sprint burn down. Here you're sending your product backlog burn down. If you're not on schedule, what actions have you planned to get back on schedule? If the burn down is clearly showing that it doesn't look likely that you're going to ship, are you already planning some scoping actions or other actions to make up for it or not? If the burn down is not looking good and you have no planned actions, then that's going to raise concerns and questions with me and Shrey, and we are more likely to come in proactively to support your team. Retrospective actions. So if you have run a retrospective, what action items came out of it? What would you want to change and why? Try to explain that to us, and then either we just say, okay, go ahead and do it, or we want to have a meeting with you and discuss in more detail and help you understand the pros and cons of the decision you're about to do. The idea is not to, again, the idea is not to limit your freedom of how you work. We just want to make sure that you don't do things that you will regret later and will prevent you from, or will make it very unlikely for you to finish a game by the end of the year. Sprint commitments. What is the commitment for the next sprint? So about the sprint that you're going to start next. So you will not be able to send this report out until you've reviewed your previous sprint and planned your next sprint. Again, goal of the sprint as PBIs, and what was the committed velocity versus your historical velocity. And at this stage, I will jump into the template and show that to you. If I can find it amongst all of my tabs. One does not simply find a new tab. Okay, you should be seeing a presentation now. And again, Jones or somebody from the program should be sharing this with you briefly. So the idea is that you can name it with your team. And if you're not familiar with this format, it means year, month, day. I prefer it that way because it's just easiest format for all nations in the world, because there's no confusion which comes first, dates or months. I'm born 24th of January, and there's one bouncer in the US that wouldn't let me into a bar because he thought my ID was fake, because he thought I was born on the 24th month of the year, and he was so smart and educated that he knew that there's only 12 months in a year. So yay for American school system. So I prefer a date that way. There's never confusion about it. So team name, what's your iteration name or number? What the dates of that iteration were? What is your game status? Oh, maybe I should do the slide so you can actually see something. What is your game status? Whatever you want to do. Maybe some release notes of what's new on it, how to get it, what the version number is, or just some videos and screenshots, whatever you want to share. I leave it up to you. If you provide a way to play the game, then more coaches are likely to download it and play it and give you feedback. Then we move to the sprint report part. What were your high-level goals, if you had any? What were your PBI level items? Names of the items, sizes, and done, not done status. Then your velocity, your burn down. Then we go to project status, product burn down, actions to get back on schedule. I assume there's gonna be many times and moments where you're slightly out of schedule and you will need to make some actions. If you're on schedule, everything looks great, then fine. You don't need any actions, obviously. Then you can omit this slide or put a big smiley face on it. Retrospective, what were your retro results? Depending on how you do your retros, you fill that in. And what are the actions? What are the changes you want to make and why? Next sprint, again, your goals. Obviously, no done, not done status at this point because we don't know it yet. And here you won't have a finished burn down, but you can put the early empty burn down or leave it empty and just put your historical velocity data. Sorry, I confused myself. You want to put here your velocity graph that you can generate with my template as well as your historical and committed velocities. So to make it very simple for you, I also included an example in this template. Imaginary team called Pink Unicorns. Feel free to stay in the name if you want. Their first sprint went from 1st to 15th of April. They have provided me a GitHub link, a username and password, how to log into it, and some release notes, what is new in the build, so that you can then make sure that people like Jussi and Klaus focus on the new features of the build and give you feedback on the new features rather than a random feature that is not ready for them to review, for example, yet. I did not generate AI screenshots. I guess I could have. And then look at this sprint. You have done 3 of your 4 PBIs, and there's a short explanation why you didn't finish the first one. You have the sizes there. Remember, these are the backlog points, not the sprint points. And then here's your historical velocity data, what the committed was and what the achieved was, and the related chart using the template. Here's your sprint burn down, how your sprint went. here's your product burn down, how your product is looking, and what actions are you planning to do to get back on track. This team didn't share me the retro results, but here's what they want to do. They want to change the sprint starting on Thursdays. They want to run retrospectives only once a month, and then that would be for me and Ray to decide on. And next sprint, there's the goal for your sprint. There's the PBIs and the sizes, and there's the historical velocity data and the commitment. So they are committing to more than their historical. So this already tells me that they're trying to be ambitious, and there's a high chance that not everything's going to get done. So that's the template. Any questions on the reporting to coaches and the template?
Is this a relevant way to report right now if Ray is asking me what has happened in 2.5 months since we last talked by tomorrow?
Well, I think you need to catch up with Ray to the day-to-day stuff. But ideally, by sending this report, we would stay aware of what's going on in your teams, and it will be easier. You don't have to do other updates as much. Then this means also that when you have this, the coaches know what to ask from you. Hey, I saw in this report this and that. What does this mean? Ideally, we would have had some sort of report format from the beginning of the year, but the program is still evolving. Also remember that the coaches now have a responsibility to evaluate the teams on a quarterly basis, who are going to continue into the next quarter and who are not as teams. So this is also providing a tool for coaches on that. The biggest challenge for us coaches is we don't know enough about what's going on in your teams. So it's very hard for us to help you. And we often come without enough context, which makes those moments when we do try to help you less efficient, because you have to do exactly that. You have to update on us on what's happened over the last 2 months. The way the program is structured, we do not want to use the funds of the program for coaches having regular meetings and syncing with each other. We want to spend the money on coaches spending time with you, and we want to focus that time as cost effectively as possible to the teams that need, and matching the right coach to the right team needs. And this report is trying to serve that need as well. So it's unfortunate that Trey is not up to speed, but if you can get him up to speed, then he's more able to help you. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you.
I am open to getting feedback on the template and format. If you find it a lot of work, if some parts of it doesn't work, we have 0 reports so far, so we might find out ways to improve it for the rest of the year and for the future years of the GameLAB. But I tried to keep it lightweight. I tried to make it easy for you, providing templates, and just focus on the information. I'm fully aware that some of the information is not of interest to all the coaches. Some of it is more interest to me than anybody else, but I'm trying to help you stay on schedule, and this is all intended for that. The first part about the game is probably relevant to every single coach in the program. Again, if it's too much work, let us know, give us feedback, and we can improve it. But we do need some sort of reporting from you for the coaches so that the coaches can better support you. Okay. So we only have the Kanban Bart left, but I think we only have 6 minutes of the scheduled time remaining. I don't think it makes sense to go into that. Well, maybe we can go a little over time, at least from my side, and those who can't stay can watch it on video. So we can do that, and we don't need to schedule another lecture. If there are specific topics you would like to be then coached, feel free to get in touch, and we can book one-on-one sessions with those teams focused more on that. This applies to the acceleration and incubation teams as well. If you've been following this lecture series and you understand this basic framework, you might be more advanced in some areas than the lab teams, but I'm available to all 3 types of teams for more individualized coaching on how to take this into practice in your work. And remember, this works for small teams. So if you start to be more than, let's say, 15 people in your team, you will need to be adding additional elements to this for it to work. This does not scale well beyond about a team size of 15 or so, maybe 20, but it's definitely best at a small team size. We are then starting to talk about agile, scaled agile methods, which there are multiple ways of organizing that as well. But with that, let's jump into Kanban. So thank you everybody who needs to drop off at the time. This will go slightly over time. So this is a bit of a pet peeve of mine. What is in this picture is a Kanban board, but it is not the same thing as Kanban as a process. And whenever I talk to people about Kanban, they often think that they're doing Kanban because they're using a Kanban board to drive their Scrum. So Kanban is another Japanese word and highly misunderstood. This is closer to something that a Kanban could look like. This is how you would make a character, one type of a character pipeline that I found online. And mapping this as part of your project management tools is what Kanban as a process is all about. So you would map all of those stages into a Kanban board instead of just to do work in progress and done. And even from that, what I call Scrum board, I often use, as you've seen in the previous lectures, a modified version that has additional columns based on my needs. But I would model that process into those columns so that I could then flow work visually across those different stages. And you see in red here, WIP limits. That means work in progress limits. And the idea is that each stage has limit how many items can be there at once, which is trying to prevent multitasking and clogging the system at different stages. There might be only one concept artist, and we only want them to work at 2 concepts at a time. Or there might be 2 concept artists, and we only want each of them to work on 1 concept at a time. Whatever it is, we are purposefully designing that we do not want more than those items there. And then instead of pushing items to the pipe, each stage is pulling an item from the previous stage only when they're ready with their previous work. And that's then trying to get the flow of work to be more even. Just like water has turbulence if it's moving too fast, when the work is flowing at a more even pace, it creates less turbulence and less chaos and less stress for people. And actually the throughput of how fast we can get the work flowing through the the metaphorical pipeline that we're visualizing here, the better it gets. So new work, when it's ordered, can be ordered at any time. Kanban as such is not an iterative process. It is not running in loops and cycles like Scrum. It's an ongoing process that goes on for as long as new work is ordered. So at any time, people can add work to the backlog and they can prioritize the backlog. It could be a simple FIFO, first in, first out priorities, or it could be always prioritized by somebody who's making that decision, a product owner type, to use Scrum terminology. Could be your art director in terms of character pipeline, or it could be the producer or EP. But whoever is prioritizing it, they're putting new work in there into the backlog and prioritizing it. And there can be as many items as the backlog as we want, but we do not pull them into the later stages more than the WIP limit allows. Then the team pulls, like I already said, pulls the new work. Nobody's pushing it to their table. When they have room in their WIP limit, they go and pull work from the previous stage. And then you measure the time it takes for the work to stay in each stage. You also measure the cycle time, which is the time from when the first team is pulling it from the backlog to when it moves to done. That's your cycle time. That's the entire cycle time of how long it takes to complete that item. And then lead time goes from when somebody put a new item to the backlog, how long does it take to get to the end? And you start recording these times, and you start recording averages of these times, which gives you a lot of flow data, a lot of information, how things flow here. And then you can optimize your pipe. You can add new stages. You can then better decide, oh, we thought we needed more people in texturing, but actually, if we put more people in modeling, we can get this pipe going faster. And these are then very advanced tools that you can use to really optimize the cost of asset production. You can either optimize the cost or the throughput time. If you want things to get done faster, and that's a bigger priority than cost, then you're prioritizing this differently. Not all of these tools are necessarily relevant for you, but sometimes people think that, oh, we don't want to do Scrum because there's so much overhead on it. We're just going to do Kanban. Well, what's the value of that Kanban for you then? How is it helping you estimate when the game is getting done? So it's a very different type of process. And what some teams then do is they put buffers there. So when the concept artist is done with their work, instead of the work lingering in concept, they move it to ready for modeling. And then that's only a place where they stand until the modeler is ready to pull it from there to modeling. Why would you do that? Well, because it gets you better data here. It gives you a more accurate estimate. How long does it average take for things to be in concept stage? And then it shows you this buffering time. And in an ideal flow, this buffer time would always be 0. When this is fully optimized, you don't need these buffers because it's always 0. But by putting them in there, it helps you visualize it, and it helps you figure out where those bottlenecks are, because there's any process as a bottleneck, and you're trying to optimize and minimize the bottleneck out of the system. You could also add things for review. If an art director needs to prove it before it goes to the next stage, you could add art director review column. And if you need a buffer for it, it could be ready for art reviews. This could then visualize to you that the real bottleneck is the art director and his review cycle, not actual concept artists. And then that means art director needs to spend more time reviewing, or needs to delegate that and give the team more authority over it, or needs to make somehow more lightweight the review process for optimizing the pipe. Doesn't make any difference adding anybody else into the pipe if the bottleneck is the art director and his reviews. So just like any agile process, Kanban doesn't necessarily fix anything. It's just helping you visualize where the problem is. To use an ugly metaphor, the shit flows to the surface so that you're more able to identify what's wrong with the system and improve it. And that's the purpose of Kanban. What is Kanban good for? It's ideal for content pipelines and predictable work. And it's about optimizing the throughput of the system to make, for example, as many characters as possible for your game. It is not ideal for iterative, explorative work, which is often what feature development in games is. So it serves a very different need than a Scrum. Scrumban is some mixture of the two that isn't really a thing, but people think is a thing. But Kanban and Scrum used in parallel in the same game project, in the game studio, is completely realistic. And where you would then do it is many of the asset pipelines, such as art, could be using Kanban, while all the feature development is done in Scrum. And that is a way to utilize both within one game. But teaching Kanban in more detail than that isn't really in the scope of this. If you do consider using Kanban for something, then I highly recommend that you book a session with me just focused on Kanban, because like I said, it is quite complicated and it is a completely different kettle of fish And most people completely misunderstand the purpose, the intent, and the tools that Kanban provides you, because they're just focused on this as a Kanban. And this is why I sometimes get a bit triggered when people call this board a Kanban board. Yes, technically it's a Kanban board, but by doing a Kanban board doesn't mean that you're doing Kanban process. You can do anything with a Kanban board, a Scrum or anything. So unfortunately, we are using that term for multiple things, but it does come from this definition, this original Japanese definition, which is signboard or billboard. And it was used in the Toyota manufacturing model. They had physical Kanban boards in their workplace. And that's where the terminology comes from. But I just wanted to give you a short introduction to it, because a lot of people have been asking about Kanban and can they use Kanban and what is Kanban. Now you have at least some idea what Kanban is and isn't. It is not just a board. There's an actual process system called Kanban, just like there's Scrum, or framework more than a process. That's it. That's the end of my multi-part lecture series. We managed to catch up on the schedule almost, after being a little overtime last time. Keep those reports coming. Hopefully you'll get the template soon from Jones. Work with Shrey more on the daily basis, and reach out to me if and when you need more coaching from any project management topics. If you have another topic, you don't know which coach to work with, talk to Jones and they will find you the right coach. Whether that coach is in the program today or not, they can always go and find new coaches for the program if there's a clear need. I thank you for your time. Hopefully these were valuable for you. Hopefully we didn't go through too much too fast. I know there's a lot of concepts coming here, but that's what the one-on-one coaching sessions are then, to dig in deeper into those specific areas that your team is struggling with, because every team is slightly different. But thank you. I will end the recording now, and we can still stay on for further questions, both in writing and on microphone, for those who want to stick around.